At 14 years old, Marcus Chen had already buried his parents and inherited a $2.8 billion tech empire. But 8 months into running TechFlow Solutions through legal guardians, he discovered something that made quarterly earnings calls seem simple. His grandparents, the company's founders, were living alone in a Buckhead mansion with moderate-stage Alzheimer's. 6 professional caregivers had quit in 3 weeks each, costing him $180,000 in broken contracts. The board of directors delivered an ultimatum that made his stomach drop. Stabilize their care in 30 days or lose the presidency and watch his grandparents get transferred to an institutional facility. When the 7th caregiver walked through the front door that Tuesday morning, she came with credentials he'd never seen and a condition that would change everything. Marcus had been managing the company remotely from his penthouse in Midtown Atlanta, surrounded by tutors and advisors who handled the legal complexities of a minor running a Fortune 500 company. But this was different. His grandparents, Helen and Frank Chen, had built TechFlow from a garage startup in 1983 into the Southeast's largest enterprise software provider. They'd also developed what neurologists called conjugate dementia, a rare phenomenon where spouses develop Alzheimer's simultaneously. The condition manifested in ways that sent every previous caregiver running. Extreme agitation when separated, auditory hallucinations at dusk, violent rejection of strangers who tried to help with basic tasks like bathing or medication. The pattern was always the same. Professional agencies would send their best people, armed with impressive resumes and standard protocols. Within days, they'd be calling Marcus with reports of aggressive behavior and unmanageable episodes. The caregivers would attempt medication compliance, try to establish boundaries, and inevitably separate the couple during personal care routines. Frank would become combative. Helen would retreat into non-verbal distress. The house on Peachtree Street would fill with tension until another resignation letter arrived. But when Denise Williams arrived that Tuesday, carrying a worn leather messenger bag and wearing scrubs that had seen real use, she didn't immediately try to engage with Helen and Frank. Instead, she spent her first 3 days sitting quietly in the corner of their living room, watching. She observed how Frank's hands trembled differently in the morning versus afternoon. She noted that Helen's agitation peaked exactly 27 minutes before sunset. She documented which TV programs made them restless and which seemed to calm them. Marcus found this approach frustrating. He was paying $45,000 a month for action, not observation. During their first progress meeting, he couldn't hide his impatience. The other caregivers at least tried to establish routines, he said, pacing the marble foyer while his grandparents napped upstairs. You've barely interacted with them. Denise looked up from a notebook filled with careful handwriting. The other caregivers failed because they treated symptoms instead of understanding patterns, she said calmly. Your grandfather's aggression isn't random. It happens when people try to rush him through tasks his muscle memory knows should take longer. Your grandmother goes nonverbal when she's overwhelmed by too many choices. They're not being difficult. They're trying to communicate with the tools they have left. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. The breakthrough came during Marcus's 3rd week of barely controlled panic. He had a crucial board call scheduled for Thursday morning, one that would determine TechFlow's acquisition strategy for the next quarter. The legal conference room in the Midtown office was set up, but his tutors insisted he take the call from home to demonstrate his commitment to family responsibilities. Marcus positioned himself in the downstairs study, laptop open, wearing his most professional shirt above pajama pants the camera wouldn't catch. 15 minutes into his presentation about market expansion opportunities, Frank's voice erupted from upstairs. Not words, but a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than language. A howl of confusion and fear that cut through the hardwood floors and professional composure like a blade. Board members' faces appeared in small video windows, eyebrows raised, whispers muted but visible. Marcus felt his credibility crumbling in real time. He expected Denise to rush upstairs, maybe restrain Frank, certainly do something to stop the disruption. Instead, she remained seated at the kitchen table, calmly writing in her notebook. The howling continued for another 30 seconds before shifting into something that sounded almost like singing. Then silence. "I'm sorry for the interruption," Marcus managed, his voice tight. "We're dealing with a medical situation that's under control." Under control. The phrase felt hollow as he watched 3 board members exchange glances that suggested they were questioning his judgment about more than just market expansion. After the call ended badly, with promises to reconvene when circumstances permit, Marcus found Denise in the kitchen, heating sweet tea in a saucepan. His grandparents sat at the breakfast table, sharing a plate of crackers with the focused attention of people completing an important task. "What just happened?" Marcus asked. "Your grandfather was having an episode of auditory processing confusion," Denise explained, not looking up from the stove. "He was hearing the sound of your voice but couldn't locate the source. In Alzheimer's patients, this can trigger fight or flight responses. When I didn't try to suppress or redirect the response, it resolved naturally into vocal self-soothing, which you heard as singing." Marcus stared at her. "You have a degree in this stuff, don't you?" For the first time since she'd started working for him, Denise smiled. "I have a master's in geriatric neuropsychology from Emory, with specialized training in dementia care environments. I also spent 4 years working with high-net-worth families whose medical needs require discretion and expertise that goes beyond basic caregiving." The revelation hit him like a physical force. He'd been thinking of her as expensive hired help. She was a specialist whose qualifications exceeded those of most doctors he'd consulted. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "Because you hired me as a caregiver, not a consultant," she said simply. "And because your grandparents needed someone who could see them as people first, patients second. The moment I start explaining their behavior in clinical terms, I risk losing the connection that makes care possible." That afternoon, while his grandparents napped, Denise showed Marcus her notebook. Pages of meticulous observations revealed patterns he'd never noticed. Helen became agitated when the afternoon light hit the living room at a certain angle, creating shadows that looked like people moving. Frank's aggressive episodes always preceded his attempts to communicate something important, usually a physical need he couldn't articulate. Their insistence on sleeping in the living room recliners instead of their bedroom wasn't stubbornness, it was adaptation. The bedroom had become too overwhelming, too full of objects they could no longer identify. The previous caregivers failed because they tried to impose normal routines on a brain that no longer processes normal, Denise explained. But that doesn't mean there's no order. There's just a different kind of order, one that requires patience to discover. Over the following days, Marcus watched Denise implement changes that seemed small but created ripple effects throughout the house. She replaced the overhead fluorescent lights with warm lamps that didn't flicker. She removed the bedroom television that had been providing company, but was actually creating visual noise that increased confusion. She established a routine of playing specific songs from the late 1950s during meal preparation, music that seemed to activate some preserved memory pathway that reduced anxiety. Most importantly, she stopped trying to separate Helen and Frank during personal care. Previous caregivers had insisted on privacy and professional boundaries. Denise recognized that their 60-year marriage had created interdependence that transcended cognitive decline. When Frank needed help in the bathroom, Helen's presence actually calmed him. When Helen required assistance with bathing, Frank's voice, providing gentle encouragement, made the process possible. The changes weren't dramatic. Helen and Frank didn't suddenly return to their former selves. But the house grew quieter. The daily episodes of agitation decreased from multiple occurrences to occasional events. Most tellingly, they began asking for Denise by name when she arrived each morning, the first consistent verbal recognition Marcus had witnessed in months. 3 weeks into what Marcus privately called the Denise experiment, the board of directors announced an independent medical evaluation. Dr. Sarah Morrison from Piedmont Hospital's Geriatric Psychiatric Unit would assess Helen and Frank's care needs and determine whether institutional placement remained necessary. The evaluation would include interviews with Marcus, a review of medical records, and direct observation of the caregiving environment. Marcus spent the night before the evaluation awake, staring at the ceiling of his childhood bedroom and running worst-case scenarios. If Dr. Morrison deemed the home situation inadequate, the board would have medical justification for removing him from decision-making authority. His grandparents would be transferred to a memory care facility. The company they'd built would continue under professional management until he reached 18, assuming the board didn't find reasons to extend that timeline. Dr. Morrison arrived on a Thursday morning, carrying a tablet and wearing the kind of professional smile that revealed nothing. She spent an hour reviewing documentation, asking Marcus questions about daily routines, medication compliance, and safety protocols. Her questions felt like a test he hadn't studied for. The previous care reports indicate significant behavioral challenges, Dr. Morrison noted, scrolling through her tablet. Multiple incidents of aggression, medication, non-compliance, sleep disruption. What's changed? Marcus looked toward the kitchen, where Denise was helping Helen and Frank with their morning routine. Through the doorway, he could see his grandfather carefully spreading peanut butter on toast, while his grandmother arranged napkins with the focused attention of someone completing vital work. "We found someone who understands them," Marcus said finally. Dr. Morrison's evaluation continued through lunch and into the afternoon. She observed Denise's interactions with Helen and Frank, noting their responses to her presence and her methods for managing challenging behaviors. She reviewed the detailed care logs Denise had been maintaining, documentation that revealed not just what happened each day, but why certain approaches worked while others failed. The breakthrough moment came when Dr. Morrison asked Frank a series of cognitive assessment questions, standard protocol for evaluating dementia progression. Frank became agitated, his answers fragmented and confused. Then Denise quietly started humming "Moon River," a song from 1961 that appeared frequently in her notes. Frank's breathing settled. His answers became more coherent, not because his cognitive function had improved, but because his anxiety had decreased enough to allow access to preserved memories. "That's not a technique they teach in medical school," Dr. Morrison observed. "No," Denise agreed. "It's something you learn when you spend time understanding what makes each person feel safe." Dr. Morrison's report, delivered to Marcus and the board the following Monday, contained language that would reshape his understanding of competent care. The current caregiving environment demonstrates evidence-based practices consistent with specialized dementia care protocols. The caregiver shows advanced understanding of neuroplasticistic approaches to cognitive decline management. Behavioral incidents have decreased by 78% since current caregivers' implementation of individualized care strategies. Institutional placement is not recommended at this time. 78%. Marcus read that number 3 times before it registered fully. Denise hadn't just stabilized his grandparents' condition. She'd created measurable improvement using methods that hospitals and professional facilities had failed to implement. The board meeting that followed Dr. Morrison's report was unlike any Marcus had experienced. Instead of being questioned about his judgment, he found himself being asked to explain Denise's methods. Board member Patricia Hawkins, whose own mother had struggled with dementia before her death, leaned forward with genuine interest. "This kind of specialized care," she said, "it's not available through most agencies, is it?" Marcus realized she was right. Denise's combination of advanced clinical training and practical experience with high-needs families was rare. Most caregivers had one or the other, but not both. Most families couldn't afford to search for months and pay premium rates for someone with her qualifications. "What if we made it available?" he asked. The room grew quiet. Marcus felt the familiar sensation of an idea taking shape, the same feeling he got when he could see a market opportunity before his competitors recognized it existed. "TechFlow employs 12,000 people across the Southeast," he continued. "Most of them are going to face aging parent situations at some point. What if we created a benefit program that provided access to specialized dementia care? Not just insurance coverage, but actual expertise." The proposal that emerged from that meeting would take 6 months to implement and cost TechFlow $2.3 million in the first year. The company would partner with Emory University's geriatric program to train a cohort of specialized caregivers. Employees facing family dementia situations would have access to assessment, care planning, and, if needed, placement of trained professionals who understood both the clinical and emotional complexities of cognitive decline. Marcus announced the program at TechFlow's annual employee meeting held at the Georgia World Congress Center downtown. Standing at a podium in front of 1,500 employees, he talked about the intersection of business success and family responsibility. He talked about learning to recognize expertise even when it came from unexpected sources. And he talked about his grandparents, who were sitting in the front row with Denise, applauding politely when their names were mentioned. "Some people might say this program is expensive," Marcus said, looking out at faces that included software engineers, administrative assistants, and sales managers who'd built their careers at the company his grandparents founded. "But the real cost is what happens when we fail to support the people who support us. When we assume that caring for our families is separate from succeeding in our careers. When we don't invest in understanding what people actually need." The program launched 6 months later with 43 participating families. Denise became the training coordinator, developing curriculum that emphasized observation over intervention, pattern recognition over protocol adherence. The first cohort of caregivers completed their certification with evaluation scores that exceeded industry standards. But the real measure of success was smaller and more personal. On a Tuesday evening in December, nearly a year after Denise first walked through the front door of the Buckhead mansion, Marcus found his grandparents in their living room. Helen was reading aloud from a magazine, her voice steady and clear. Frank was listening with the focused attention of someone following an important story. When she finished the article, he looked up and said, "That was good, Grandma," using Marcus's childhood name for her. It was the first time in months that Frank had initiated conversation with a family reference that made sense. Helen smiled and patted his hand. "I'm glad you liked it, Grandpa." Marcus stood in the doorway, watching this exchange that might have lasted 30 seconds, but represented months of patient work to preserve connection despite cognitive decline. Denise was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner and maintaining the quiet routine that had become the foundation for these small victories. The metrics told part of the story. Sleep disruption events decreased from nightly occurrences to twice weekly. Medication compliance improved to 94%. Episodes of severe agitation dropped to less than 1 per week, usually coinciding with changes in weather or routine that could be anticipated and managed. But numbers couldn't capture the moment when Frank recognized Marcus during a board meeting conducted from home, looking up from his crossword puzzle and saying, "There's my grandson, the CEO." Numbers couldn't measure Helen's increasing willingness to ask for help with tasks instead of struggling in frustrated silence. The house on Peachtree Street developed a rhythm that accommodated cognitive decline without surrendering to it. Morning routines included music from the Eisenhower administration, Afternoon activities focused on familiar tasks that provided purpose without pressure. Evening meant dim lighting and gentle conversation that didn't require memory or complex reasoning. Denise's notebook, now in its third volume, continued documenting patterns and responses, but increasingly, her entries focused on preservation rather than crisis management. Which activities brought moments of joy? Which conversations seemed to activate preserved memories? Which environmental changes supported the kind of connection that made care feel like relationship rather than medical intervention? On the anniversary of Denise's first day, Marcus sat in the kitchen where he'd confronted her about her methods, watching her help Frank water the plants that had become his daily responsibility. Helen supervised from her chair, offering encouragement and gentle corrections that Frank accepted without frustration. "You saved them," Marcus said when Denise joined him at the table. She shook her head. "I didn't save them. I learned to see them. There's a difference." Marcus understood that difference now in ways he couldn't have imagined a year earlier. Saving implied returning people to some previous state of function. Seeing meant accepting who they were becoming while preserving who they had been. It meant recognizing that competence could look different than he'd expected, that expertise sometimes came from unlikely sources, and that the best care happened when someone took the time to understand rather than simply manage. The Tech-Flow Dementia Care Program expanded to serve 127 families in its second year, with a waiting list that stretched across multiple states. Other companies began inquiring about licensing the training model. Medical schools started referencing Denise's observational protocols in their geriatric curricula. But for Marcus, the measure of success remained personal and immediate. It was Helen's increasing vocabulary as her anxiety decreased. It was Frank's ability to complete crossword puzzles when the environment supported his concentration. It was the way both his grandparents now smiled when Denise arrived each morning. Recognition that had become reliable and genuine. At 15, Marcus was still the youngest CEO in Tech-Flow's history, but he was also something else, something that couldn't be measured in stock prices or quarterly earnings. He was a grandson who'd learned that true leadership sometimes meant admitting you didn't understand something and finding people who did. That the best decisions came from recognizing expertise wherever it appeared, even when it challenged your assumptions about who held knowledge and how that knowledge should be applied. If this moment hit you, tap like. It helps more people find these stories. The mansion in Buckhead remained home to 3 generations, each learning from the others in ways that traditional family structures rarely allowed. Marcus learned patience from watching Denise work with his grandparents' changing needs. Helen and Frank experienced care that treated their condition as one aspect of their lives, rather than the defining characteristic. Denise found an environment where her specialized training could create outcomes that satisfied both clinical standards and human dignity. On quiet evenings, when the house settled into its comfortable rhythm, Marcus sometimes reflected on the phone call that had changed everything. Not the board ultimatum or the medical evaluations, but the moment Denise had called to accept his job offer with her one non-negotiable condition, that she be allowed to care for Helen and Frank as whole people, not just as patients with a diagnosis. That condition had seemed like a luxury he could afford. It turned out to be the foundation for everything that followed. Understanding that care was relationship, recognizing that expertise came in forms he hadn't learned to recognize, accepting that some problems couldn't be solved, only lived with more gracefully. The numbers supported the story. Behavioral incidents decreased by 78%, sleep quality improved by 65%, medication compliance reached 94%. But beyond the metrics was something harder to quantify and more important to preserve, the sense that even as cognitive decline progressed, connection remained possible. That dignity didn't depend on perfect function. that families could adapt to changed circumstances without abandoning hope for meaningful relationship. Marcus's leadership of TechFlow continued to earn recognition from industry publications and business schools. The company's revenue grew steadily, its market position strengthened by strategic acquisitions and product innovations. But when reporters asked about his most significant achievement as a young executive, Marcus talked about the dementia care program and the lesson it had taught him about recognizing competence in unexpected forms. "The best decision I made wasn't about software or market expansion," he told a reporter from Fortune magazine. "It was learning to trust someone who knew more than I did about something that mattered more than quarterly profits." And the interview ran with a photo of Marcus at his desk in the TechFlow headquarters, flanked by screens showing stock prices and development timelines. But the quote that got shared most widely on social media came from the final paragraph. "Sometimes the most important thing a leader can do is admit they need help and then get out of the way of people who know how to provide it. Tell me in the comments what you would have done differently here. I actually read them." As Helen and Frank's condition slowly progressed, Denise adapted her methods to meet their changing needs. Some abilities declined, but others remained stable or even improved with proper support. Frank's crossword puzzle skills stayed sharp when he worked in the morning hours when his concentration peaked. Helen's reading comprehension remained strong when she chose her own materials and wasn't pressured to perform. The house developed systems that anticipated needs rather than reacting to crises. Visual cues replaced verbal instructions that might be forgotten. Daily routines provided structure without rigidity. Social interaction happened at times and in ways that reduced rather than increased stress. Marcus learned to participate in these routines as a family member rather than a supervisor. He helped with evening meals, contributed to conversations about topics his grandparents could engage with, and provided the kind of consistent presence that supported their sense of safety and connection. The business lessons translated beyond healthcare into Marcus's approach to running TechFlow. He learned to identify expertise in team members whose contributions might be overlooked by traditional evaluation metrics. He implemented policies that supported employees dealing with family responsibilities. He created decision-making processes that valued insight over seniority and results over recognition. The dementia care program became a model for other companies seeking to support employees facing similar challenges. Research partnerships with universities generated data that influenced best practices in both corporate benefits and clinical care. Most importantly, it demonstrated that business success and social responsibility could be mutually reinforcing rather than competing priorities. Marcus's grandparents lived in their home for another 3 years after Denise's arrival. As their condition progressed, the care team expanded to include additional specialists, but Denise remained the primary coordinator and the person they trusted most completely. When Helen passed away peacefully in her sleep at age 87, Frank's grief was profound but manageable within the supportive environment they'd created. He lived another 18 months, maintaining his daily routines and his relationship with Marcus until his own quiet passing. The funeral services were held at Druid Hills Baptist Church, where Helen and Frank had been married 63 years earlier. Marcus spoke about grandparents who'd built a company and raised a family, while demonstrating that success meant more than financial achievement. Denise spoke about the privilege of caring for people who'd taught her that expertise meant understanding what truly mattered. The obituaries noted Helen and Frank Chen's business accomplishments and their role in founding TechFlow Solutions. But the details that mattered most to Marcus were smaller and more personal. The way Frank had continued completing crossword puzzles until the week before his passing. Helen's habit of humming Moon River during quiet moments, a song that had become part of the family's daily soundtrack. The fact that both had died, knowing they were loved and cared for by people who saw them as complete human beings, rather than medical cases to be managed. At 17, Marcus inherited his grandparents' estate, along with the full weight of leading TechFlow without legal guardianship restrictions. The board of directors, who had once questioned his competence to make personal care decisions, now looked to him for guidance on policies that balanced business objectives with human needs. The dementia care program had evolved into a comprehensive family support initiative, serving over 300 families across the Southeast. Employee retention rates improved as workers felt supported through personal challenges that might otherwise force them to choose between career advancement and family responsibilities. The program's success attracted attention from healthcare policy researchers and corporate responsibility organizations seeking replicable models. But for Marcus, the program's significance remained rooted in the lesson Denise had taught him about recognizing expertise and trusting competence wherever it appeared. When TechFlow faced technical challenges, he looked for solutions among team members whose insights might be overlooked by traditional hierarchies. When the company considered expansion opportunities, he consulted employees whose cultural knowledge provided perspectives that market research couldn't capture. The leather notebook, where Denise had first documented Helen and Frank's behavioral patterns, became a template for systematic observation in other contexts. TechFlow's product development teams adopted similar documentation methods for understanding user needs that weren't explicitly articulated. Sales teams used pattern recognition techniques to identify client concerns that standard presentations failed to address. The company's culture shifted toward valuing careful observation and patient understanding over quick fixes and conventional solutions. Marcus kept one of Denise's notebooks in his office desk, not as a memento, but as a reminder of the difference between managing problems and understanding them. When employees brought him challenges that seemed intractable, he often asked the same question Denise had posed during her first week. What patterns have you noticed that others might be missing? The approach didn't solve every problem, but it changed how problems were approached. Instead of immediately seeking to fix or control difficult situations, TechFlow's leadership learned to observe and understand first. Instead of assuming that standard protocols would work in unique circumstances, they developed customized responses based on specific needs and contexts. 5 years after Denise first walked through the front door in Buckhead, Marcus stood before another employee meeting, this one celebrating TechFlow's recognition as one of the Southeast's best places to work. The company had grown to employ over 18,000 people, with offices in 6 states and revenue approaching $4 billion. Success in business, like success in life, requires recognizing that other people know things we don't, Marcus told the audience. The smartest thing I ever did as a leader was hire someone who was more qualified than I initially understood, and then trust her to do work I couldn't do myself. That decision didn't just help my family, it taught me how to build a company that values expertise over hierarchy, understanding over authority, and results over recognition. Oh! Denise, now director of TechFlow's Family Care Initiative, sat in the front row with other senior staff members. She'd completed additional certification in family systems therapy and corporate wellness program development, expanding her influence beyond direct caregiving into policy and training design. Her work had been featured in healthcare administration journals and business school case studies, examining the intersection of employee benefits and organizational culture. The ripple effects continued expanding. Other companies licensed TechFlow's training materials for their own family support programs. Medical schools incorporated Denise's observational protocols into geriatric care curricula. Corporate responsibility organizations cited the Family Care Initiative as evidence that business success and social impact could be mutually reinforcing. But the validation Marcus treasured most came in smaller moments. Employees who approached him at company events to share stories about parents or spouses whose care had been improved by program resources. Team members who credited the initiative with helping them remain productive at work while managing family responsibilities that might otherwise have overwhelmed them. Managers who reported that the patience and observation skills they'd learned through family care training had improved their leadership effectiveness in unexpected ways. Marcus's office in the TechFlow Tower on Peachtree Street overlooked the city where his grandparents had built their company and where he'd learned his most important lessons about leadership. On clear days, he could see toward Buckhead, where the house that had been home to 3 generations now served as a training center for the Family Care Initiative. The living room where Helen and Frank had spent their final years, where Denise had first demonstrated the power of patient observation, was now a classroom where new caregivers learned to see patterns others might miss. The transformation felt complete, but not finished. Each year brought new families needing support, new employees facing caregiving challenges, new opportunities to apply the principles Denise had taught him about recognizing competence and trusting expertise. The work continued because the need continued, but also because Marcus had learned that the best responses to human challenges were ongoing relationships rather than one-time solutions. At 22, Marcus remained the youngest person to lead a Fortune 500 company, but age had become less relevant as his competence proved itself through results that mattered beyond stock prices. Industry publications wrote about his innovative approaches to employee benefits and corporate social responsibility. Business schools developed case studies examining TechFlow's culture and its impact on both financial performance and employee satisfaction. The recognition was gratifying, but Marcus measured success differently than he had at 14. Success meant building systems that supported people through their most difficult challenges. It meant creating environments where expertise was recognized and valued, regardless of its source. It meant understanding that true leadership required the humility to admit ignorance and the wisdom to trust people who knew better. The notebook in his desk drawer contained Denise's observations about Helen and Frank's daily patterns, detailed documentation of what worked and what didn't in caring for people whose needs couldn't be met through standard approaches. But it also contained a larger lesson about the importance of paying attention, asking questions, and remaining open to learning from sources that might not fit conventional expectations. When young executives asked Marcus for leadership advice, he often talked about that notebook and the woman who'd filled it with careful observations that had seemed unremarkable at the time, but had created the foundation for everything that followed. The lesson wasn't about healthcare or family responsibilities specifically. It was about recognizing that competence came in many forms, that expertise often resided in unexpected places, and that the best decisions emerged from understanding rather than assumption. The moment I stopped thinking I knew what my grandparents needed and started trusting someone who actually understood their situation, Marcus would tell them, was the moment I learned how to lead a company. Not by having all the answers, but by finding people who did, and creating environments where their knowledge could make a difference. If this gave you hope today, subscribe. We're building a small corner of the internet for that. The TechFlow Family Care Initiative continued growing, serving over 800 families by its 7th year and expanding into partnerships with healthcare systems and aging services organizations across multiple states. The program had generated enough data to influence policy discussions about employee benefits and family support at both state and federal levels. Research publications cited TechFlow's model as evidence that comprehensive family care benefits could improve business outcomes while addressing social needs that traditional healthcare systems struggled to meet. But the program's most significant impact remained personal and immediate. Families who gained access to specialized care that preserved dignity while managing decline. employees who could focus on their work responsibilities without abandoning their caregiving commitments, communities where the expertise to provide high-quality dementia care had become more available and more affordable. Marcus's leadership of TechFlow earned recognition that extended beyond business publications into discussions about corporate responsibility and social innovation. He served on advisory boards for aging policy organizations and healthcare reform initiatives. Universities invited him to speak about leadership development and employee engagement. Policymakers consulted him about programs that could address the growing intersection of workforce needs and family caregiving responsibilities. The recognition was meaningful, but Marcus remained focused on the work itself rather than the acclaim it generated. Each month brought new families into the program, each requiring the kind of individualized assessment and care planning that Denise had pioneered with Helen and Frank. The challenge was maintaining quality while expanding scale, preserving the patient observation and customized response that made the program effective. The solution emerged from the same principle that had guided the program from its beginning, trusting expertise wherever it appeared. Instead of trying to replicate Denise's specific methods across all situations, TechFlow trained caregivers to develop their own observational skills and pattern recognition abilities. Instead of creating rigid protocols, the program emphasized adaptive thinking and flexible responses to unique circumstances. The training center that had been Helen and Frank's home became a laboratory for testing new approaches to care that honored individual needs while meeting clinical standards. Caregivers learned to document their observations systematically, share insights across cases, and develop innovations that could be tested and refined through practice. The result was a community of practitioners whose collective expertise exceeded what any individual could achieve alone. Marcus often visited the training center, not to oversee operations, but to learn from the people whose work continued advancing the field he'd accidentally entered when his grandparents needed care. The conversations reminded him that leadership meant creating conditions for other people's expertise to flourish, rather than trying to direct every aspect of complex work. The house in Buckhead retained the quiet atmosphere that had made healing possible for Helen and Frank. New trainees learned in the same living room where Denise had first demonstrated the power of patient observation. They practiced techniques in the kitchen, where Marcus had discovered that his assumptions about competence needed serious revision. They developed skills that would serve families facing challenges similar to those that had once seemed insurmountable. On the 10th anniversary of the day Denise first walked through that front door, Marcus stood in the living room addressing a graduating class of family care specialists. 23 men and women who'd completed 8 months of intensive training in observation, assessment, and individualized care planning. People who would return to their communities, equipped to provide the kind of expertise that most families couldn't access through traditional healthcare channels. 10 years ago, I thought I was hiring a caregiver, Marcus told them. I was actually finding a teacher who would change how I understood competence, leadership, and the difference between managing problems and solving them. The methods you've learned here didn't come from textbooks or research studies, though they're supported by both. They came from someone willing to sit quietly and watch until she understood what 2 people with Alzheimer's actually needed, rather than what protocols said they should need. The graduates would serve families across the Southeast and beyond, carrying skills that had been developed through trial and error in one Buckhead mansion and refined through years of systematic application and improvement. Some would work directly with families. Others would train additional caregivers or develop programs for healthcare systems and community organizations. All would carry forward the principle that had made their training possible, that expertise deserved recognition regardless of its source, and that the best care happened when competent people were trusted to do work they understood better than anyone else. The ceremony concluded with recognition for Denise, whose patient observation of two confused elderly people had generated insights now used by hundreds of families and dozens of organizations. Her notebook methodology had been adapted for use in contexts far beyond dementia care. Her emphasis on pattern recognition over protocol adherence had influenced training programs in multiple healthcare disciplines. Her insistence that dignity and clinical competence were compatible rather than competing goals had helped reshape conversations about aging, disability, and family caregiving. But the recognition that mattered most to Marcus remained simple and personal. On quiet evenings, when he reviewed reports from program participants, reading about small victories and sustained improvements in families facing their most difficult challenges, he remembered Helen humming Moon River while Frank worked his crossword puzzles. He remembered learning that competence could look different than he'd expected, that leadership sometimes meant getting out of the way, and that the most important decisions were often about trusting people who knew things he didn't. The mansion in Buckhead continued serving as a training center, its rooms filled with new voices, learning to provide care that honored both clinical standards and human dignity. The company his grandparents had built continued growing and evolving, guided by principles that valued understanding over authority and results over recognition. The notebook in Marcus's desk drawer remained a reminder that the best solutions often came from careful observation rather than quick assumptions. At 24, Marcus had learned that true leadership meant creating environments where other people's expertise could flourish. That business success and social responsibility could be mutually reinforcing rather than competing priorities. That the smartest thing a leader could do was recognize competence wherever it appeared and trust people to do work they understood better than anyone else. The lesson had started with two elderly people who needed care, one young man who didn't know how to provide it, and one woman whose qualifications he'd initially underestimated. It had grown into a program serving hundreds of families and a company culture that valued expertise over hierarchy. But it remained, at its core, a story about the importance of paying attention, asking questions, and remaining open to learning from sources that might not fit conventional expectations. Years later, when business schools used TechFlow's Family Care Initiative as a case study in corporate social innovation, students would focus on the program's structure, its funding model, and its measurable outcomes. But Marcus knew the real lesson was simpler and more fundamental. Sometimes the most important thing a leader could do was hire someone more qualified than they initially realized, and then trust that person to do work that mattered more than quarterly profits. That trust had saved his grandparents from institutional care. It had taught him how to lead a company, and it had created a model for supporting families that continued expanding because it was built on a foundation of recognizing and respecting human expertise wherever it appeared. The work continued because the need continued, but also because Marcus had learned that the best responses to complex challenges were ongoing relationships built on mutual respect and shared commitment to outcomes that mattered beyond immediate recognition. In the end, the story wasn't about caregiving or business leadership specifically. It was about the willingness to admit ignorance, seek expertise, and trust competent people to do important work. Those principles had transformed a crisis into an opportunity, a business challenge into a social innovation, and a young man's assumptions about leadership into a foundation for creating lasting, positive change. The ripple effects continued expanding in ways Marcus couldn't have anticipated when he'd first stood in his grandparents' living room, watching a stranger sit quietly in the corner with a notebook. The tech flow model influenced policy discussions in state legislatures considering how to address the growing intersection of workforce needs and family caregiving responsibilities. Healthcare systems began developing training partnerships with corporations seeking to support employees facing similar challenges. Business schools started teaching case studies that examined how companies could create competitive advantage through comprehensive employee support rather than traditional benefits packages. But the changes that mattered most remained intimate and immediate. In suburban Atlanta homes, where families had learned to provide specialized care that honored both clinical needs and personal dignity. In corporate offices where employees could focus on their professional responsibilities without abandoning their caregiving commitments. In communities where the expertise to manage complex medical situations had become more accessible and more affordable than traditional healthcare systems could provide. Marcus received letters from employees whose lives had been changed by access to resources they'd never expected their workplace to provide. A software engineer whose father's Parkinson's symptoms had stabilized through specialized physical therapy. An administrative assistant whose mother's stroke recovery had been supported by communication specialists who understood both medical needs and family dynamics. A sales manager whose husband's depression following early-onset dementia diagnosis had improved through counseling that addressed both clinical symptoms and relationship challenges. Each letter reinforced the lesson Denise had taught him about the difference between managing problems and understanding them. The families who benefited from TechFlow's program weren't just receiving services. They were gaining access to expertise that recognized their unique circumstances and developed customized responses rather than applying standard protocols that might not fit their specific situations. The training center in Buckhead continued evolving as new cohorts of caregivers completed their certification and began working with families throughout the Southeast. The curriculum expanded to address not just dementia care, but other complex medical situations that required specialized knowledge and individualized approaches. Graduates learned to work with families facing Parkinson's disease, stroke recovery, traumatic brain injury, and other conditions that demanded both clinical competence and emotional intelligence. The program's success attracted international attention. Healthcare policy researchers from Canada and the United Kingdom visited Atlanta to study how TechFlow's model might be adapted for different healthcare systems and cultural contexts. Corporate responsibility organizations from Europe and Australia requested consultation on developing similar programs for their member companies. The United Nations cited TechFlow's Family Care Initiative as an innovative example of how private sector resources could address social needs that government programs struggled to meet effectively. Marcus found himself speaking at conferences where business leaders, healthcare administrators, and policymakers gathered to discuss solutions to challenges that crossed traditional sector boundaries. The audiences were impressed by TechFlow's financial success and employee satisfaction metrics. But the conversations that followed his presentations invariably focused on the human elements that had made the program possible. Recognizing expertise in unexpected places, trusting competent people to do important work, and creating systems that supported both business objectives and social needs. The most difficult part wasn't developing the program, Marcus would tell these audiences. It was learning to recognize that I didn't understand something I thought I should understand, and then trusting someone who actually did understand it to teach me what I needed to know. That lesson applied to caregiving, but it also applied to leadership, product development, employee engagement, and every other aspect of running a company. The notebook methodology that Denise had developed while caring for Helen and Frank had been adapted for use in contexts far beyond family caregiving. TechFlow's product development teams use similar observational techniques to understand user needs that market research couldn't identify. Sales teams applied pattern recognition skills to identify client concerns that weren't explicitly articulated. Customer service representatives learned to document recurring issues in ways that revealed underlying problems rather than just symptom management. The corporate culture that emerged from these practices attracted employees who valued both professional achievement and meaningful work. TechFlow's retention rates exceeded industry averages by significant margins. Employee satisfaction surveys consistently ranked the company among the best places to work in the Southeast. Recruitment efforts attracted candidates who specifically sought environments where their expertise would be recognized and where they could contribute to outcomes that mattered beyond immediate financial returns. The mansion in Buckhead had become more than a training center. It was a symbol of what became possible when people were willing to challenge their assumptions about competence, expertise, and effective solutions to complex problems. The living room, where Helen and Frank had spent their final years, where Denise had first demonstrated the power of patient observation, continued serving as a classroom where new caregivers learned skills that would serve hundreds of additional families. But the house also served as a reminder of the personal cost that had made the larger success possible. Marcus kept photos of his grandparents in his office, images that captured them during their healthy years when they'd built TechFlow from a garage startup into a regional technology leader. The photos reminded him that business success meant more than financial metrics. It meant creating value that honored the people who'd made that success possible and the communities that continued supporting it. At 25, Marcus had been running TechFlow for over a decade, longer than many executives twice his age had led their companies. The business press still occasionally mentioned his age when writing about TechFlow's innovations or financial performance. But age had become less relevant as his competence proved itself through results that mattered to stakeholders who cared about more than stock prices. Employees whose families received support through difficult transitions, communities where specialized care had become more accessible, and an industry that had learned new approaches to corporate responsibility. The lessons he'd learned from watching Denise work with his grandparents continued influencing decisions that seemed unrelated to healthcare or family services. When TechFlow considered acquiring smaller technology companies, Marcus looked for organizations whose expertise complemented rather than duplicated existing capabilities. When the company faced technical challenges, he sought solutions from team members whose insights might be overlooked by conventional evaluation processes. When employees proposed innovations that challenged established procedures, he created opportunities for testing and refinement rather than dismissing ideas that didn't fit current practices. The approach didn't guarantee success, but it changed how success was defined and measured. Instead of focusing exclusively on financial returns or market position, TechFlow evaluated performance through multiple metrics that included employee satisfaction, community impact, and long-term sustainability. Instead of prioritizing short-term gains that might compromise future opportunities, the company invested in relationships and capabilities that would create value over time. The Family Care Initiative had grown beyond its original scope to include programs supporting employees facing various life challenges, educational assistance for workers pursuing advanced degrees, financial counseling for families managing economic transitions, mental health resources for employees dealing with stress, anxiety, or depression, housing assistance for workers relocating for career opportunities. The programs shared common characteristics. They recognized individual needs, provided access to specialized expertise, and created support systems rather than one-time interventions. Each program reflected the principle Denise had demonstrated while caring for Helen and Frank, that effective help required understanding specific circumstances rather than applying generic solutions. That expertise came in many forms and deserved recognition regardless of its source. that sustainable improvements emerge from relationships built on trust and mutual respect, rather than hierarchical authority and standardized protocols. The success stories continued accumulating. Families who'd maintained dignity and connection through medical challenges that might otherwise have been overwhelming. Employees who'd advanced professionally while managing personal responsibilities that could have derailed their careers. Communities where resources that had once been available only to wealthy families had become accessible to middle-class workers through employer-sponsored programs. But Marcus measured success through smaller and more personal metrics. The thank you notes from employees whose parents had died peacefully at home rather than in institutional settings. The graduation ceremonies where program participants completed training that would allow them to serve other families facing similar challenges. The quiet moments in his office when he reviewed reports documenting improvements that couldn't be captured in quarterly earnings statements, but represented the kind of value that made business success meaningful rather than merely profitable. The leather notebook that had started everything remained in his desk drawer, its pages filled with Denise's careful observations about two elderly people whose needs had seemed impossible to meet through conventional approaches. The notebook had become a template for systematic observation, pattern recognition, and customized response that had influenced programs serving hundreds of families and thousands of employees. But it remained, fundamentally, a record of what became possible when someone took the time to understand rather than simply manage. Marcus often returned to that notebook when facing decisions that seemed particularly complex, or when employees brought him challenges that didn't fit established categories. The pages reminded him that the best solutions often emerged from careful observation rather than quick assumptions. That expertise deserved recognition regardless of whether it came from expected sources. That sustainable success required building systems that honored both business objectives and human needs. The story that had begun with a 14-year-old CEO inheriting responsibility for grandparents with Alzheimer's had evolved into something larger and more significant than family caregiving or corporate innovation. It had become a demonstration of what became possible when people were willing to admit ignorance, seek expertise, and trust competent individuals to do important work. Those principles had applications far beyond the specific circumstances that had first revealed their importance. Years later, when Marcus spoke at conferences or consulted with other companies seeking to develop their own employee support programs, he would return to the fundamental lesson that had made everything else possible. The moment I stopped thinking I knew what my grandparents needed and started trusting someone who actually understood their situation, he would say, was the moment I learned that leadership meant creating environments where other people's expertise could flourish rather than trying to direct every aspect of complex work myself. The principle sounded simple, but its implementation required ongoing commitment to recognizing competence in unexpected forms, challenging assumptions about who held knowledge and how that knowledge should be applied, and creating systems that supported both individual needs and collective objectives. It required the humility to admit ignorance and the wisdom to trust people who knew better. It required patience to observe patterns that might not be immediately obvious, and flexibility to adapt responses as circumstances changed. The TechFlow Family Care Initiative continued expanding, not just in scope but in sophistication. The training programs had evolved to include partnerships with universities developing research on aging, disability, and family systems. The service delivery models had been refined through years of experience serving diverse populations with varying needs and resources. The policy impact had influenced discussions at state and federal levels about how to address demographic changes that would affect millions of American families over the coming decades. But the program's most important achievement remained unchanged from its origins in a Buckhead mansion where one woman had demonstrated the power of patient observation and individualized care. It continued proving that business success and social impact could be mutually reinforcing rather than competing priorities. That expertise came in many forms and deserved recognition regardless of its source. That the best responses to human challenges were ongoing relationships built on understanding rather than one-time solutions based on assumptions. The work continued because the need continued, but also because Marcus had learned that meaningful success required more than financial achievement. It required creating value that honored the people who made that success possible and the communities that supported it. It required building systems that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining commitment to principles that transcended immediate challenges. It required the ongoing willingness to learn from people who knew things he didn't, and to trust their expertise even when it challenged his preconceptions. In quiet moments, when the demands of running a $4 billion company allowed for reflection, Marcus would remember the sound of his grandmother humming Moon River while his grandfather worked crossword puzzles at the kitchen table. He would remember learning that competence could look different than he'd expected, that dignity didn't depend on perfect function, and that the most important decisions often involved trusting people whose qualifications he'd initially failed to recognize. Those memories remained vivid, not because they represented the past, but because they continued informing the present. The lessons learned in one living room with two confused elderly people and one patient caregiver had created principles that guided a company serving thousands of employees and hundreds of families. The notebook filled with careful observations had generated insights now used in contexts far beyond its original purpose. The willingness to admit ignorance and seek expertise had become the foundation for innovations that continued expanding because they addressed real needs with effective solutions. The story wasn't finished because the work wasn't finished. Each year brought new families needing support, new employees facing challenges, new opportunities to apply principles that had proven their value through sustained results. The story continued because it was built on a foundation that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining commitment to recognizing expertise wherever it appeared and trusting competent people to do important work. That foundation had transformed a crisis into an opportunity, a personal challenge into a business innovation, and a young man's assumptions about leadership into a model that other organizations continued studying and adapting. But it remained, at its core, a reminder that the most important thing a leader could do was create environments where other people's knowledge could flourish in service of outcomes that mattered more than immediate recognition or conventional measures of success.